Hello and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. I am joined by our resident dietitian, Miss Amy Hollenkamp. Hello, my darling.
Hello, hello, hello.
Tell the good folks at home what we're going to be talking about today.
We are going to be talking about, I would say, low carb and keto in general. I find that it tends to be a go-to for some in the gut health space. I know I've talked to some some patients where they've worked with practitioners and their practitioner is very adamant that they have to be low carb or keto and that sort of thing. And again, it's not that I'm necessarily anti-keto or anti-low carb. I think it's more I haven't necessarily seen it be the most successful strategy for the majority of the clients that I work with. There could still be cases where it might make sense to do a little bit more of a keto or maybe a little bit more of a low carb diet. But I would say for the most part, I find that going keto or too low carb can be problematic for a lot of people. And it might not be the best diet. And it all kind of goes back to diets are individual. So if someone is generally putting all their clients on low carb or keto, to me, that's a red flag. And so I wanted to just have an episode where we're talking a little bit about some of the drawbacks of going low carb from a gut health standpoint and from an overall standpoint. But then also, again, acknowledging that there are times where keto makes sense. And I think probably a good place to start to is like, how did keto come about? In keto, I would say, in the traditional sense, is very low carb. Sometimes when people are talking about keto, I'm like, it's not quite like what is traditionally meant as keto. Traditional keto used by dietitians is like 90% of your diet's fat.
90% of your calories.
Oh,
right?
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
90% of your calories are fat.
Yeah.
So again, you're getting a very small amount of carbs and a very small amount of protein.
Yeah.
That's more of a traditional keto style diet that's used a lot for things like epilepsy. Like I will say, for conditions like epilepsy, sometimes neurological conditions, keto can be great for those sorts of issues. Again, even within those, there's probably individual differences. But I know here we have Cincy Children's, and they have like a couple dietitians that are dedicated to keto diets for epilepsy. So, I do think that there's a time and place for it. Traditionally, again, it was used more from like a medical nutrition therapy perspective for things like epilepsy. I think in certain situations, potentially going low carb if there's a degree of insulin resistance makes sense. Again, there's still variation within that in terms of what someone's going to do well with.
And
but
you touched on something. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
You touched on something. So you can kind of think of it like there's the umbrella of low carb. And then underneath that umbrella, there's keto, which would be basically no carb and high fat. Atkins is worth mentioning because Atkins is low carb, but it's also pretty high in protein. And honestly, I feel like a lot of people who say they do keto are doing something much closer to Atkins, but they're labeling it as keto. Or maybe they're like halfway between the two. And then you have like, theoretically you could do low carb and still do lower fat. I don't know how that would work. You would starve. But there's all these different variations and like a spectrum in between. But you have like the higher fat, but also really high protein world of Atkins. You have the low protein, almost no carb, high fat world of keto. And then you probably have a lot of areas in between.
Yeah, I like that you're parceling it out because I do think just with how popular keto has gotten, there's these fragments of different things that are popping up, and I think you're right. Probably even more of the Atkins style, higher protein, higher fat, just low carb is more of what I see people doing on their own. And again, they're saying, oh, I'm eating keto. There is definitely a difference between the traditional keto style diets from like a registered dietitian, medical nutrition therapy world. But I think, again, when we think about keto, people are thinking about really low carb, but fat and protein is kind of the more common view of keto. And then you're right, there is sort of this lower carb aspect. And I do think that some people just naturally go a bit low carb when they're going on some of these more restrictive SIBO diets, because they're removing grains or something like that, even going a bit paleo. Like maybe keto or low carb, I should say, wasn't intentional, but there's an unintentional lowering of carbs that you might want to be a
gravitation.
Right. I think that it's very easy to gravitate towards low carb if you're on more of like a paleo style diet, or like you're removing grains or removing starches or that kind of thing.
Yeah. Low fermentation, SCD to some degree as well.
Right. Like you think about like SIBO specific, where it's like SCD, low FODMAP kind of combined. That's going to be a little trickier to get carbs. It's not to say that you can't, because I definitely think you can, but it predisposes you to be lower carb. And
if you think,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say most Americans get the majority of their carbs probably from the gluten-containing grains, wheat, barley, and rye, which are no-go on FODMAP, and maybe corn as a runner-up, and some corn products are going to be higher on the FODMAP spectrum too, and wouldn't be SCD compliant, and then like potatoes are kind of iffy depending on the person. So when you get into all of these SIBO diets, whether it's low FODMAP, SCD, low fermentation, like a lot of them are going to gradually tip you toward lower carb, whether or not that was the intention or not.
Yeah, and I would say that's generally where I see my clients falling, is like maybe they're not acknowledging that they're being keto, or they're just unaware that they're a little bit lower carb than maybe what would be optimal. And you know, everyone's going to have a little bit of a different set point in terms of how much carbs they need. But I think what I have seen is that generally people can miss the mark, I think, in the gut health space because of some of these restrictive diets. And then especially if you're honing in on wanting to do a keto diet, or that you're doing a strict keto diet, especially longer periods of time, like there might be some sort of therapeutic benefit to do a keto diet very short term for some individuals. I even think like keto diet might naturally reduce some of the fibers that might be problematic for some individuals, so they might feel a bit better doing keto for a period of time. They might have less bloating, that kind of thing. But it could be really problematic to go keto more long term. And even some of the keto advocates seem to be changing their tune a little bit in terms of
I've noticed that too.
How long you should be going on keto. And I haven't really followed like Dave Asprey in a super long time, but I even know like back a few years back when sometimes I would follow some of his stuff, he would talk about, you know, there has to be some like breaks in keto. Like he was starting, his tune was starting to change a little bit.
I saw something from Mercola that said something similar. Like, I forget what they called it. Maybe carb cycling, but that doesn't sound correct. But he basically, I saw an article from Dr. Mercola a couple years ago, like maybe 3 years ago, where he was saying like once a week, eat some sweet potatoes or some bread, or like give yourself that challenge essentially, so that your metabolism remains flexible, and then you can go back to doing your keto during the week if you want. But I thought it was interesting because that's how a lot of this goes, right? Like a new diet comes on the stage. Like paleo was the poster child of this in like, 2012, 2013, 2014. That was like the era of of paleo, and like Chris Kresser became really popular. The Paleo Mom became really popular. Like all of these like paleo celebrities popped up. And then after some time, people started saying like, well, maybe we can make some tweaks. Like it always starts out as like, you have to do it strictly and follow the protocol. And it's like really regimented initially. And then gradually, the more it kind of gets out into the world, people are like, oh, maybe we can be a little bit flexible with this. Or like, maybe you can add rice even though it's a grain and it's not technically paleo. Like if you can tolerate it, maybe that's okay. So I feel like the same thing is very slowly happening with keto, where keto kind of came on the scene in my brain much more so like 2016, 17, 18, 19 into the 2020s-ish. I don't really have a perception of when it started, but it's like keto really came on the scene at that point. And again, like everybody was doing it super strict. And now only in the last like 3 years, a couple of people are starting to say that you might want to have some carbs like 1 day a week. And I think it's like, I don't want to call it the beginning of the end of keto, but it's like the beginning of that like era of flexibility, thankfully. So hopefully people aren't quite so cray with it anymore.
Right. And again, I think that with any sort of diet, there's always nuance. And again, some people are going to need more carbs than others. Yes. And I'm glad you pointed that out. And again, I work majority with women. You probably do too. I think they're just naturally going to get help more. And then I think IBS is more common in women.
True.
And so it's not a huge shock that we work a little bit more with women. But I mean, some of the hormonal effects from going low carb and keto for too long could just be really problematic for women. Mm-hmm. We're way more glucose sensitive. Or like I should say we're way more sensitive to total carb intake than men. Mm-hmm. And again, we have a much more sensitive hormonal network that's happening within our bodies because we're the baby makers. So our body's constantly trying to determine, do we have enough fuel to produce a baby? Whether we want a baby or not, that's what our body is doing as women. Right. Our body's job from an evolutionary standpoint is to make little babies. So our body's always trying to monitor that and change things around if it feels like we do not have resources for a baby.
Thank God, right? Like, can you imagine, like, being in the middle of a famine or being in the middle of, like, I don't even know, like the bubonic plague or being in some, like, major crisis in the world and then making a bunch of babies and having to raise a baby in and amongst all of the chaos of a famine or something? Like, no, absolutely not.
Right. And, I think that there's kind of there's a lot of hormonal things that happen with carb intake and where your levels are at. If your carbs are a little bit too low, I think the general trend that I see happening is, again, cortisol sort of has to take over in terms of regulating blood sugar. So if you're eating carbs, that's how you're maintaining blood sugar primarily, is through your intake of carbs. Your body's using those carbs, putting them into the bloodstream, and then you wait a little while and usually it goes down a bit and then you eat again and then the carbs go into the bloodstream again. And we do have some stores in the liver. Mm-hmm. So we have glycogen stores where we store a little bit extra glucose. So then if we run out, the liver is releasing glucose into the bloodstream. And, there's a certain level of carbs you need to maintain that process. Now, if you run out of glycogen stores and you're not eating carbs, that's when you start to get cortisol release, because cortisol is what's needed to break down protein to make glucose to maintain blood sugar. Because if we don't have blood sugar, we die. That's just how it goes.
No matter how much you hate carbs, you need blood sugar to survive. End of story.
Right. Exactly. So again, it's not that our body can't maintain blood sugar without carbs. It's almost a little bit of like a stress response. in an adaptation, that's a little bit of a stressor. I've actually heard Chris Masterjohn talk about it in this way. Like, it's a little bit of a stressor to have to start breaking down protein in order to make carbs.
Well, if you think about it,
using
your
cortisol.
tissues are made out of protein and your muscles are made out of protein.
Right.
So it kind of, on some level, physiologically, it probably feels like a crisis to your body because the interpretation might be, oh shit, we're breaking stuff down. This stuff's getting real. We've got a really serious situation on our hands if we're breaking down protein and turning it into carbs.
Right. Well, and carbs, you know, and the reason we need blood sugar to maintain a certain level is because our nervous system needs glucose at all times. Mm-hmm. I know that, you know, the brain can run off ketones to some degree, but, you know, our nerve cells need glucose to function too. I think there's, again, this idea, oh, I just need fats and that's all I need for my brain to function. But you have to have glucose.
Yeah, and it's like your intake versus what's in your bloodstream might be a little different. Because like you said, like you might not have to take in carbohydrates to survive, but you're still always going to have glucose in your bloodstream. Like you're never going to get to a point doing keto where your blood glucose, your blood sugar level gets down to like 0 or 5 or 10 because you would be in a coma. So even when you're doing keto, like strict hardcore keto, you're still going to have blood sugar in like the, you know, 70, 80 range probably. And that's okay. You know, no matter how strict your keto diet is, you're going to have blood sugar. And that's okay. But the difference is if you have somebody who's like type 2 diabetic or severely insulin resistant and has like on a day-to-day, if their blood sugar is in the 200s, if you could get their blood sugar back down, you know, consistently below 100 in that like 70, 80 range for fasting, maybe up into like the 90s or low 100s after they eat, like that is moving the needle closer to normal, ideal physiology and ideal blood sugar levels. But it's like how you get there is by restricting dietary carbohydrates. But you're always going to have blood sugar floating around in your bloodstream. And if you didn't, you would die very quickly.
Right. And I think it's more of like, for just the general person that doesn't have insulin resistance, like it's more like, are you going to be relying on this cortisol response, which comes with its own set of issues? Like if you're relying on cortisol to be maintaining your blood sugar at all times, it is a part of kind of stress chemistry. So it'll affect your gut function. It'll affect a lot of these other areas. So if you're constantly living in that state, it can be problematic. And then I think the other like major hormonal thing, and I think the sex hormones get affected too, but I always think of like cortisol and thyroid hormones being the most sort of skewed by low carb. But you know, thyroid hormones, they typically need a degree of insulin to promote conversion from T3 to T4. So if you're not eating enough carbs, you can have lower insulin levels, which could affect the activation of your thyroid hormones. So if you're someone that's kind of had some thyroid issues or even like suboptimal levels, like maybe your T3, free T3 or something isn't super low, but it's kind of suboptimal. I see that a lot with clients. To me, that could be a carb issue. Like I've definitely seen people come to me on lower carbs and maybe their free T3 is like 2.6 or something. So it's a little bit on the lower end. And then when they start adding carbs back in, it increases into the 3s. So, you know, I think that there's definitely a thyroid side of the equation. And to me, again, that's all determining how much short-term fuel you have. So the body's trying to gauge like how much short-term fuel do you have to burn readily, and it's going to try to adapt based on that. And if you're not getting enough carbs and producing enough insulin, it feels like there's less short-term fuel to use, and that's why it's starting to downregulate thyroid hormones. But I mean, as we've talked about in prior episodes, as the thyroid hormones downregulate, you get a lot of digestive and motility issues that come along with that. So again, women, I would say, are definitely much more susceptible to some of these like hormonal shifts. Mm-hmm. I would say than men. Doesn't mean men can't have some of these similar effects too.
Yeah.
I would just say to the degree of dysfunction that it can cause, I definitely see it being a little bit more common in women.
And you could kind of think of it too, almost from the perspective of there are more variables with women in a way. Because like men, honest to God, men are simple creatures.
Right.
Like it's just testosterone. That's the thing that really matters 99.9% of the time from a hormonal perspective. If you're a dude and your testosterone is good, you're probably good. You don't even need to stress about the other hormones 99% of the time. But with women, we have parts of our physiology that are very much influenced by testosterone, as well as estrogen and progesterone. And remember that all of the hormones talk to all of the other hormones. So thyroid imbalance is going to cause imbalances in estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Imbalance in cortisol, which is a hormone, is going to cause problems with estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, and then vice versa. So it's like this really complicated web of physiology that's really cool, but really overwhelming to learn, where we kind of can't talk about any one hormone in isolation because they all affect each other so much.
Right.
And then we get into this world of low carb, which essentially is tinkering with a hormone, insulin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you start, but that's what makes it impactful too. Like it's a double-edged sword. Where there is potential for great benefit, there's also the potential for great harm. And that's where I think the dialogue needs to shift is like right now. And again, I saw it with paleo and that kind of world. And now I'm seeing it again with keto. You see all of these influencers and people on the internet who are like, keto's great. It's perfect for everyone. It's the perfect diet. There's no negative consequence whatsoever. Everybody should do keto. And it's like, well, no, it's going to be great for some people, mediocre for some people, and harmful for other people. And you really need to take that decision very seriously because you are impacting a lot of physiology and a lot of nutrition when you make this shift. And it may or may not be ultimately beneficial. And to that point, let's pause here and say, are there situations where you feel like keto is particularly indicated or contraindicated? And I want to lead us with one real quick.
Before we do that, do you care if I make a couple points of what kind of along with what you were just saying, and then we can definitely dive into that?
Go ahead.
So one other thing I'd mention about insulin, and again, it just goes to say, again, how all these things are connected. But insulin, again, tells our body we have short-term fuel, which, again, I also have heard plays a big impact in sex hormones. Dr. Laura Briden, have you heard her work before? Yeah. Mm-hmm. She's kind of big in the hormonal side of things, but she talks about, insulin and then something called leptin, which comes from our fat cells, is really what triggers like ovulation. Like we won't ovulate if our body senses we don't have enough short-term fuel or if we don't have enough long-term fuel. And so it uses insulin and leptin a lot of times for sex hormone, like analyzing where those levels are at. So I think that that's really important. The other thing that I will say too that happens a lot with people that go low carb is they just are going low calorie. They've taken out carbs and they haven't replaced enough fatty foods to reach their necessary calorie goal or calorie needs. So that's a huge problem too, because again, it can lead to some of these same hormonal problems. But if, like we've talked about before, ad nauseum, is that if you're kind of under eating, pretty much digestion, motility, all these things shut down, hormonal things get really messed up. So there could be an aspect too for some people that are doing keto where they're not necessarily doing it to meet their needs quite right. And again, I would say too, if you're someone that's considering keto or you think it might be indicated for your situation, definitely work with a provider that can help you do it correctly so that you're not getting deficient in certain things or undernourished.
Yeah.
Because, again, if you're removing like tons of carbs, nutrient deficiencies can be really common that you have to pay attention to, but also, you know, you might be under calories if you're dipping if you're not replacing the carbs with added fats.
And I'll add, so again, the parallels amuse me. This was a thing with paleo, and it still is to a degree, and it's very much a thing with keto. The irony of what you're talking about is that one of the major selling points for both of those diets is, hey, you don't have to count calories because this is magically going to correct all your issues. And it's like, yeah, like you don't have to calorie count in the same sense, right? Like you don't have to stress about overeating and gaining weight on like a super low carb diet because it probably won't cause you to gain weight as much. And like with paleo, similarly, you don't have to calorie count for fear of gaining weight, but you might want to check in for like a week, a couple times a year, or like quarterly, and just do like a little bit of a chronometer readout on yourself or work with a professional for a while just to make sure that you're not severely under eating, because that actually could be problematic.
Right, for sure. I think the lack of focus on nutrition, like it's so weird because it seems to be overly focused on nutrition and like pulling things out, but I find that people are not looking at granular enough nutrition, and it's not like you have to drill down to like one vitamin and mineral, but I think that a lot of times we think, oh, if we just follow this strict diet, all the problems will go away, or this will be optimal for me. But so often, even just with my gut clients, it's like we look at their diet and again, they're way lower in carbs than they thought, or they just like weren't paying attention, and we have to adjust. Or again, maybe they're meeting their carb needs, but they're not meeting their protein needs. So like there's just a lot. I think focusing on how to best nourish your body with different macros or micronutrients gets lost in the sauce when we have such diet dogma that is sort of like nothing else matters if you're doing keto, or nothing else matters if you're doing paleo, which it just isn't the case.
Well, and I'll throw this out there too, and I don't mean this to sound judgmental, but it might sound a little judgmental, but so many people are overwhelmed and underworked and undercompensated, underrested. Like that's kind of, especially in America, I forget, I remember finding a statistic on this once that like a majority of people who have paid time off never use it. Like they just let their PTO accrue and they never go on vacations because we're in such an environment. And there are other countries that can be like us in that regard. Like I know Japan is pretty intense with work life as well, but it's like people are so overwhelmed that a lot of the time we look for shortcuts with nutrition, and it turns into, like, for example, a really good friend of mine was doing the Dave Asprey version of keto. Not that long ago, maybe a year ago. She was doing that version of keto, like following his book and in his free Facebook group, the whole kit and caboodle. And she was like, yeah, this is great. It's fantastic. I'm doing bulletproof coffee, yada, yada, yada. But there was a fairly significant amount of her diet that was made up of fat bombs, where literally, I forget what it all entailed, but it was like you mix a giant glob of coconut oil or MCT oil with a big glob of like almond butter or something, and then maybe you sprinkle on like some flax seeds or something. But anyway, it was it was like fat mixed with fat rolled in fat. And they would keep those in the refrigerator, and like multiple times a day, she and her husband, who was doing it with her, would go in the fridge and just like pop a couple of fat balls. But they were using it as a shortcut because they didn't have the time or the energy or the wherewithal to actually prep the food. versus you could do keto, like you could do a keto version that was compliant with his thing, but you could have it be like boatloads of fresh vegetables and greens and salads and like lots and lots of nutrients and like, you know, some, I forget exactly what his version of it entailed. But, you know, like you could really do a very high quality nutrient dense version of keto. That's the kind of funny thing about this. Like you could do keto and have tons of like spinach and kale and onions and garlic and cruciferous vegetables and all sorts of healthy stuff. Or you could do the version of keto where you're overdoing it on dairy or overdoing it on fat bombs or nut butters or, you know, or like the chocolate that's sweetened with stevia instead of sugar. And it's like you're just swapping out the stuff that you used to eat for a kind of keto-ish version of the thing you used to eat. And I don't really begrudge people for doing it, but like that's not going to get you the same results as if you did keto where you're eating a ton of fresh vegetables and like cooking a lot of vegetables. But that takes time and money and effort. And not everybody is willing or able to do that. So it's like we have this diet that's proposed as being like the ultimate healthy diet, but the way that people are able to implement it most commonly is not very healthy. So I think that's where you really get into trouble. It's like ideal keto versus common man's keto.
Well, and I think that like, you know, anytime you remove major food groups, you have the potential to be nutrient deficient. So then if you're only eating, you know, primarily your calories from coconut oil, flaxseed, and almond butter or something, you might be getting a lot of certain nutrients, but not enough of others if you're relying on that. So there's a huge aspect of that. I also think it makes me think back to a conversation I had with Laura Schoenfeld, who is another dietitian. And we would always talk, like, it's funny, and not necessarily funny, but like it's interesting that someone would have a big plate of bacon, but then like be super freaked out by like half a banana. Like it's like, this is okay. This big thing of bacon with like nothing else is like in line with my diet, but this banana is like too much. Right. Yeah. So like, so again, I think it's the dogma that just, it's not to say bacon is bad, but like having just a plate full of bacon or just like taking it to the extreme where it oversimplifies things is where you kind of lose nutrition and you lose the ability to make the diet actually valuable if it's something that you might benefit from, which I know you were getting into. I want to make sure we come back to like contraindications and indications for doing keto.
No, and I think that this was a good way to preface that conversation because, again, like if you do keto or if you do low carb the right way, it could be a health promoting diet for some people. Right. So that's the thing. But I think the thing that frustrates both of us is that it's most of the time, I would argue 99% of the time, honest to God.
Right.
Keto and low carb is done in a really crappy way, poop pun intended, where again, it's like you're over relying on fat bombs. It's very similar again to paleo, the pitfalls I saw with that world, where people would say they were doing paleo, but their entire diet was like almond flour muffins, almond flour bread, almond flour crusted this, and, you know, almond butter mixed in this, and, you know, bacon wrapped asparagus spears where like every individual spear of asparagus had its own piece of bacon wrapped around it.
Yeah.
And like a giant steak. And it's like, okay, but you cut out this whole food group thinking it would be healthier. And now, again, like the easier way to go about this diet that's less health promoting is to overemphasize the nuts and the nut butters and the nut flours and the meat and the dairy. Like, similarly, I worked with a woman who was doing keto, but she would kind of cycle on and off of it. And this brings up another point. I've seen this numerous times too, where people try to do keto, but it's so freaking hard to do that what they end up doing is that they do keto, quote unquote, for like a week or two at a time. And then they completely go off the rails. And it's like, screw it, I'm going to go to the Cheesecake Factory. And they eat a big bowl of fettuccine Alfredo or whatever it is. And then, you know, they're having Skittles and whatever for like a day, like essentially binge eating. Like they binge eat all the garbage. And then they're like, I have to be strict about my diet again.
Right.
And then they'll do keto for a week or two. And then they fall off the rails again. And it's like, now we're using keto and it's you're dealing with a binge eating, like disordered eating kind of situation.
Right.
And again, and it like keto is a good example of a diet that teaches you to label foods as good and bad, good versus evil. And that's like the last thing you want to do with somebody with disordered eating. But I've seen that a couple times where the person like wants to be good and they want to do keto, but then it's just so hard to maintain that they fall off the rails. And then it's like the yo-yoing back and forth is probably way worse for them versus if they tried to implement slow changes. And, you know, if that same person only was able to change like 10% of their diet for a whole year and then change another 10% the following year, like it could theoretically take that person 10 years to get up to what would be considered a really, really healthy diet. But making that gradual change and not labeling things as good or bad is probably way better for that individual as opposed to letting people ricochet back and forth between, oh God, I have to do keto, I have to be good, and then, oh, it's so hard, I hate it, Cheesecake Factory, whatever. Like, it's the yo-yoing itself is very detrimental. I know we talked about that in the bile episode quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it seems to be associated with gallstones.
Yeah, I definitely think the disordered eating could be huge in the keto space. And I think, you know, we see it often. I think anytime you're restricting like bigger quantities of things or a major food group, you're going to have potential to have disordered eating. And then the other thing that you had mentioned too, again, this kind of crappy way to do the keto diet where it's like less plant foods. I mean, that's going to be so detrimental to the microbiome too. Like there's a potential way to preserve, and I still think there's potential issues of doing keto long-term for the microbiome if you're totally avoiding like starches and things like that and fruits. You're limiting your diversity, but at the same time, like you could mitigate some of that if you're having some plant foods. But I think the more you're cutting out, and simplifying things with like doing fat bombs or maybe not necessarily balancing your plate properly with keto, the more you could potentially do some real harm to the microbiome long term.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think so. And actually that segues beautifully. Can we talk contraindications now?
Yes.
Okay. So for those of you who are not in a medical field, just to not lose you here, contraindications is just who would this diet not be good for? Like who could potentially be harmed by this diet? And then we will get into the opposite in a minute of who would actually benefit from this diet. But I want to talk about contraindications first. Because like I said, with the potential to do great good comes the potential to do great harm. And you need to be aware of that. One thing from a microbial perspective is people who have any signs of fat malabsorption or fat maldigestion, I would never, ever put them on keto because then you're giving them a boatload of fat, right? So like if you get diarrhea or fat in the stool or like pale stools or like foamy stools, if you're getting those symptoms from a normal human amount of fat and then you swing over to keto and you're getting 80 or 90% of your calories from fat, you're asking for trouble from a gut perspective.
Well, it's so funny you mentioned that too, because I literally, one of my clients right now has fat malabsorption, and like in between our last talk and our most recent talk, he had was like, oh, and he had a practitioner in the past, I will say, that really heavily pushed keto. It was like kind of like scared him to think like you won't get better if you don't do keto, was pretty strict on that.
Yeah.
But he jumps on a call with me, and I think he did some sort of like service, like maybe like a meal replacement keto service or something. They had a deal, and he was like, oh, I'm just going to do this for 2 weeks. But he had fat malabsorption, and he didn't necessarily tell me. So he was really kind of funny about it, because he came to the call sort of like, oh, I should have never done this, but I did this. But again, it definitely confirmed that he had fat malabsorption.
Right. So there's an indication.
Right.
If you want to confirm that you have a fat malabsorption issue, go for the gold and do keto.
Right. So he was just like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. But yeah, he only did it for 2 weeks. So the good news is he didn't do it for too long, but it was just kind of
figured it out.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the beauty of fat malabsorption or like fat maldigestion, is I feel like the body is going to tell you, hey, this isn't working for us, because you're going to get worse diarrhea or worse symptomology from it. So on the plus side, at least with that group, they're going to find out. I will throw out too, from a microbial perspective, if you have ever seen an overgrowth on your stool testing of the hydrogen sulfide producers, so like Desulfovibrio or Bilophila, especially Bilophila, those guys like bile acids. And if you're eating a whole ton of fat, you're going to stimulate the release of a whole ton of bile. So it's not necessarily that the fat will feed those microbes, but the bile acids will. So the bile acids seem to make hydrogen sulfide overgrowth a bit worse, or feed them a bit. The other one that's a bit less researched, but I see it pretty commonly, is if you have an overgrowth of allostipes on your stool testing. And sometimes this will show up on like what was once called Somagen, but now it's called Kean, Kean is the new name for it. It'll also pop up on what was once called Thrive, now it's called Ombre, or like a Ubiome. Like any of those kind of tests, you can see the number of allostipes that you have. If your allostipes is more than like 2%, please don't do keto, because allostipes is a bile acid consumer. And the minute you start feeding it with a whole bunch of extra bile because you're ingesting a whole ton of fat, you're going to get a bloom of allostipes. So that Bilophila and allostipes are probably the top two I would worry about microbially if you already have an overabundance of them. Desulfovibrio, I would probably be concerned about that too. And to some extent, proteobacteria. If you have a whole boatload of proteobacteria floating around, like Klebsiella, E. coli, Pseudomonas, that sort of stuff, likewise, I'd probably be hesitant to give them fat, because proteobacteria in general tend to thrive in a high fat environment, particularly higher saturated fat, if I remember correctly. So, and that makes you wonder about SIBO, right? Because on the one hand, you think that you're starving the SIBO because you're not eating the carbs and the fibers, but we know now that the overgrowth, the O in SIBO, is predominantly made up of E. coli and Klebsiella, at least according to current research. And those both are under the umbrella of proteobacteria, but we also know that proteobacteria thrive in a high-fat environment. And it's kind of like, oh, you might get short-term symptomatic relief from cutting out the carbs and the starches, but in the long term, we don't know this yet, but I would speculate you might actually be favoring the overgrowth of the bacteria of the SIBO the longer you do a super high-fat diet. We don't have data on that, but it honestly wouldn't surprise me, kind of like connecting the dots the way I just did.
Right. Such a good point. Yeah, and I think to go on that in terms of contraindications, probably anyone that has a history of disordered eating might want to be careful with keto in general. I know we've already kind of touched on that, but that could be really problematic.
Amenorrhea
to do.
Also, well, I would say, and this is where it gets hairy, right? If you have lost your period because you're underweight or you're overtraining, and it's more of like that female athlete triad kind of territory, then I think keto would be detrimental to you. If you have polycystic ovary syndrome and you have an irregular period because of PCOS, and if you have confirmed that you are insulin resistant, of note, not everybody with PCOS is insulin resistant, but if you've confirmed with lab testing that you have high blood sugar, you're insulin resistant, and that's driving up the testosterone and that's causing the PCOS, that subgroup with amenorrhea might actually do really well in keto. You would have to play with it a bit. But if you've lost your period, or if your period's really irregular and you tend to be thin or underweight, or even if you think of yourself as normal weight, I would be more cautious with that, with women in particular.
Yeah, good point. I think another potential, and this could vary too depending on the cause, but I think some people that already have sleep issues or insomnia, keto a lot of times can like destroy sleep, or at least that's what I see. And it partially probably has to do to blood sugar balance at night. When you're not eating, usually our body relies on those glycogen stores, which we talked about earlier.
Yep.
If you're not eating carbs, or eating in general because you're sleeping, you have that store. But if you're eating more keto or lower carb, you might not have that store there, or enough of stores. So it can keep you up at night, and cause some blood sugar instability that can be a bit problematic.
I know I've read also, so melatonin is the neurotransmitter that we associate with the onset of sleep. Mm-hmm. So melatonin rising up will make you sleepy. You make melatonin out of serotonin, right? Another neurotransmitter. You make serotonin out of, oh Jesus, why is it escaping my brain?
Is it like tryptophan or something?
Thank you. All I could picture was a T in my mind's eye, and I was having a brain fart, so thank you. You make serotonin out of tryptophan. You need carbohydrates to shuttle tryptophan over the blood-brain barrier.
Yep.
So I have seen patients, and actually the friend who was doing keto for a little bit, she started to not sleep as well. And I suggested, I was like, hey, why don't you have like a little bit of sweet potato or a little bit of something with carbs at your evening meal? And she did find that helped with her sleep. So even if it's just that, even if you just add a little bit of carbohydrate to your evening meal, that could even be like a way that you kind of customize it to you, even if it's not keto.
Right. Well, it's funny too. If I see that sleep's off, like either where they're waking up a lot in the night or my clients having trouble falling asleep, usually I'll almost be like, we're going to like monitor your sleep. Like right out the gate, we're kind of seeing that sleep's off. Unless there's something really obvious, and we might try some stuff right out the gate. But usually it's something that I don't even really want to touch until I look at nutrition. Because there's so many aspects of nutrition. And I think even just getting enough calories in can be a big factor in the mix. But carbs, certainly, I think there's a carb threshold that I think every individual has, and trying to figure out where that is for you would help with sleep. And certainly timing some carbs in the evening if you're struggling with sleep is a really good idea. Yeah.
I will say too, this, I only noticed this once, but I had a patient work with me. One of her chief complaints was hair loss, but like her thyroid looked good, her iron looked good, like a lot of stuff looked good. And okay, I'm gonna have a truth moment here. I'm only human, so keep that in mind. From the moment we met, I suspected that the hair loss was caused by her ketogenic diet because it started like 2 months after she went keto. I didn't ever work up the courage to tell her because, and this is something to keep in mind for people at home, when you come in singing the praises of something so much, it can be a little bit scary for some, at least for me, like as like the people pleaser, it can be a little scary for me to think about questioning something that you're really, really latched onto. So similarly, like I have a patient right now who's a vegan, And it took a lot of courage for me to bring up the idea that maybe we have him like introduce some seafood and start eating some animal protein, because it's like you get so attached to something. And for her, I still to this day strongly suspect that it was because of her ketogenic diet, but I never got a chance to really bring it up directly with her. What I ended up doing, like a year after the fact, I came across that article from Dr. Mercola, and I sent it to her and was like, hey, so-and-so, like I saw this and I thought of you. I hope you're well. And then she happened to email back and said that she had started to kind of do that, like the carb cycling a little bit on her own. And she had kind of loosened up, on her ketogenic diet. She was eating a little bit more fruit. And I think if I remember correctly, I think that she did say that the hair loss had slowed down a bit at that point. But again, like I never really got up the guts to tell her that, hey, I think this is what's causing it. But that was a pretty wicked coincidence that 2 months after she started doing keto, and as a side note, she thought it was great and she sang the praises because she lost a bunch of weight, like her blood sugar. She was either pre-diabetic or diabetic and her blood sugar was way better. Like she thought it was the greatest thing ever. But that's precisely why it was really hard for me to work up the courage to try to talk to her about maybe going off of her beloved keto diet. And that's something that I think I'm working on as a clinician, is just like learning how to have those tough conversations with people when I worry that they're going to get really defensive. Similarly, I had another case or patient. She was the one where I was saying like she would be really strict for like 2 weeks and then kind of go off the rails and be really strict for 2 weeks. She came in very like gung-ho about the keto thing. One thing I would say with still on the topic of contraindications is that if you have a abnormal lipid panel and abnormal high cholesterol, I'm not saying that keto cannot help with that, and I'm not saying that keto will make it worse, but just keep an eye on it. Because again, there's like this dialogue, again, it happened with paleo and it's happening with keto too. There's this dialogue of like, oh, it's just magically wonderful for everyone. So you don't need to worry about counting calories and you don't need to worry about looking at your lipid panel because cholesterol is a myth anyway. Ah. So this particular woman had high cholesterol and high blood lipids numerous times. And she was not evaluating it because she's like, well, the keto should be helping that. And we got an opportunity to do some testing, and I not only did a lipid panel, but I did like a more advanced lipid particle size panel. And we were able to see, because it's easy to see a cholesterol panel and go, oh, well, not all of it's bad cholesterol. So, no.
Right.
But when you do the more advanced, like, lipid particle size testing, like, it's pretty hard to argue with that when you see, like, the different particle sizes and stuff. And for her, we were able to show, yeah, you have high cholesterol and high lipids still while doing keto, and it is the bad kind. Like, this is the kind that you really need to be concerned about. And the funny thing is, years prior to working with me, she had had some success and lost some weight doing like the Joel Fuhrman diet, which is basically plant-based. And so we actually had her kind of go back to that. And I saw her a couple of weeks ago. She's continued to lose weight. She hasn't had the guts to retest her lipid panel in recent months, but like she's feeling a lot better and she's lost weight. But it ended up being that plant-based was more appropriate for her. And like she'll have some meat and some seafood here or there, but it's not a big staple for her anymore. But now she's doing like, oatmeal with a bunch of fixins in it, and she's doing like lots of veggies, and she's doing fruit again and smoothies, and it's completely different. And I bet that if she had the guts to measure her lipid panel, it would look a bit better. But keep that in mind. Like if you have a history of not good looking lipid panels, don't just stick your head in the sand like an ostrich and hope for the best. Like you really want to test it and monitor it and ultimately test your hypothesis. if you hypothesize that keto is going to correct your abnormal lipid panel, you have to measure it. And you have to be willing to change your opinion if the remeasurement proves you to be wrong. Right. So I would throw that out there.
Right.
I have one more contraindication. Did you have any more for the list of contraindications?
I had one in my head and now it left me. So I'll see if it comes back around.
That's what I get for interrupting you.
No, you're totally fine. I had, again, it was on the tippity tip of my head, but I can't remember it for the life of me right now.
All right. Well, I will say my last one, and then I'll open the floor, and then we can talk about the indications. This one, it's one of those things like, if this is of interest to you, you can take it and run with it. Otherwise, my ability to discuss it is going to be a little bit limited. So we've talked a little bit about genetic SNPs, right? About how, things like MTHFR or like the BCMO1 SNP with vitamin A, like there is some conversation of the individual's genetics influencing what we need. I think that this field is still in its infancy, but it's really neat when you kind of poke around in it. It's pretty overwhelming, and I don't do a ton of this kind of work. So if you're thinking now, ooh, I'm going to go work with her and we're going to talk about genetics, don't. Because I'm not an expert by any stretch. But I dug up some notes from a class that I had taken a while back about genetic SNPs. So you could measure some of these with like a 23andMe or, Ancestry.com or some sort of test like that. I'm going to rattle off a handful of numbers and letters that's going to sound like gibberish. So if you think that you want to write this down, get a pen ready. But there is a set of 5 different SNPs that I had written down from some notes that are associated with poor response to the ketogenic diet in people who have epilepsy. So there's a little bit of this that's out there. There's probably other genetic SNPs that have to do with like fat absorption and fat transport and whatnot. And I don't know. Like, I can't speak to those. But even if you don't have epilepsy, it does make me wonder if you have some of these specific SNPs, maybe that means that you have some uniqueness in your fat metabolism that means you wouldn't get the benefits from keto in other areas of your life. I don't really know. I don't know if these are like neurology specific or if they're like fat metabolism overall. So for those of you who are nerdy and you want to plug this into like your LiveWello or 23andMe or Genetic Genie or whatever, the SNPs that you want are RS8175351, RS5219, RS5215, RS34882006, and RS22866615. So if you want to plug those into Genetic Genie or Prometheus or whatever it is, go for it. Those are the RS numbers. If you have a SNP in any of those, there might be a little bit lower chance that you would benefit from keto as opposed to somebody who has the wild type on all of those 5. Again, I can't speak to what they do or what they are, but for what it's worth, I thought I would share.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point because, I mean, in terms of indications, like epilepsy is one that I mentioned again as having a potential benefit. And I think it's so important to recognize that you need to listen into how your body is responding in order to determine if it's helpful or not. It's not just about, if it's not working, you're just doing it wrong, which again happens a lot with some of my clients. And again, maybe even in the restrictive diet space of IBS, it's like, oh, I have to remove more foods. Or if you're not doing well with it, I wouldn't hesitate to stop it. It's an experiment. Yeah. Like dietary change can be an experiment, and you have to be able to evaluate the experiment and whether it's working or not. And again, working with a provider probably would help with that process. But I think again, like in terms of indications, I think epilepsy could be something to explore. Again, there's a lot of data behind it. I would say, I know we had mentioned too, like from a different metabolic issues, like insulin resistance could be helpful. Again, another one, you want to listen into how your body's responding.
Yes.
Same thing with like the PCOS side of that, which you had mentioned potentially being beneficial to.
Again, if you have PCOS and insulin resistance.
Right.
If you have PCOS and you don't have insulin resistance or prediabetes or diabetes, then I would not suspect this would benefit you.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it's weird because, again, like one thing I noticed when I was having a lot of my blood sugar issues is that low carb didn't help. Or again, reducing carbs didn't help at all, really. And I actually took increasing carbs, and probably goes to show that I was having like some hormonal issues because I had a lot of a lagging, like my fasting was always fine. But I would have these big swings and then like these big crashes. And I think I was having some hormonal like delays in response to blood sugar spiking. So again, it's I think there just isn't hard and fast rules, but I think again, you can try the diet if you have one of these issues. It might be something to try, but not necessarily the end all be all. And you want to see how you're doing with them.
Yeah. I think also we touched on with this oncologist friend of mine that the response to keto is not uniform across all cancers. The one that I know I've seen research on that looks very, very promising is glioblastoma, which is a type of brain tumor. Glioblastoma, from the little bit I've read on it, seems to respond very well to keto. And it really, really helps. But if you have colon cancer or another type of cancer, rather than having this blanket approach of saying keto is great for cancer, you want to actually work with a provider who's trained in nutritional oncology. That would be the best. But you could also go on to PubMed, type in the specific name of your cancer, and then add the word ketogenic and see what pops up. But you don't want to automatically assume that the ketogenic diet is going to be good for pancreatic cancer or ovarian cancer or breast cancer or colon cancer, when that actually might not be the case. So keep that in mind, because it could potentially, especially with something like colon cancer, it could make the situation worse. Because again, you're potentially adding more bile acids and feeding some of those less friendly microbes and starving some of the good microbes, and you're creating more of a dysbiotic situation, which would ultimately probably be bad for colon cancer specifically. But like I said, glioblastoma, that one type of brain cancer, very responsive to keto in a like monumental, wonderful way, as far as I can tell. So keep that in mind.
Yeah. Well, and I think like disorders of the nervous system in general, like could be more responsive to keto.
Yeah.
Like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Again, maybe not in every situation, but something you could potentially try. And I think one thing to keep in mind too is if you are going to try it, I might try just like a general balanced diet first versus like if you were going from like more of a standard, which I see a lot of times people are like, oh, I went from a standard American diet straight into keto. And it's like, oh, your baseline wasn't necessarily great either. Maybe it would have sufficed and been more conducive to your lifestyle to try just a more balanced approach that's nutrient dense versus jumping straight to keto. So I think sometimes people don't necessarily have their baseline. So like maybe keto's helping them a little bit. And so they're like, I have to stay keto because I'm getting some benefit from this compared to my standard American diet. Versus how might they have felt if they came to keto from a more balanced kind of nutrient dense diet that's not as restrictive.
I have another way of phrasing it.
Okay.
What's good enough?
Right.
Like, that's what my brain keeps going to. So I'll give another example. When I was on my gut healing journey and I was cutting out foods, it came about at the time that my body really hated gluten, dairy, and sesame. And when I did my first elimination diet, I cut out gluten, dairy, soy, corn, eggs, and peanuts, I think. But I didn't cut out sesame. So for me, I didn't notice a tremendous difference because I didn't cut out that third food. And like I was eating sesame all the time because I was eating hummus like a fiend. And I had the thought at one point, well, if I had done paleo, it probably still wouldn't have corrected the issue. Well, it depends. I guess if I was super strict with paleo, because if I did paleo, I would have not been eating chickpeas, which means I wouldn't have been eating store-bought hummus, which means I wouldn't have been eating sesame. So I guess if I did strict paleo, that could have helped. But I thought, well, if I did AIP, then I would have figured it out, maybe, right? Because I would have eliminated the chickpeas because they're legumes, and I would have eliminated the sesame because nuts and seeds are no good on AIP. But it's like, what's good enough though? Do I need to do AIP? Do I need to do that level of restriction? Right. Or can I get away with just cutting out 3 foods? For me, 3 foods was good enough. And while AIP could have worked from that standpoint, it was unnecessary. It was above and beyond what I needed to do. So what you're saying, my translation was, you don't necessarily need to go above and beyond and go full-blown keto. You could probably just like upgrade your diet and make it like a healthier, balanced diet and start to increase your fiber and your variety and your fruits and vegetables. And that could give you just as much benefit or close to it, and you might not need to go the really extreme route and do keto.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that again, keep it simpler, keep it able to keep it so that you're able to sort of maintain the lifestyle that you want to lead that's easier for you to follow, because keto certainly is not a fun thing to follow. I wouldn't like cutting out carbs personally. No. So again, I think you're right. Like, it's about striking the balance of what makes sense to you. Some people might have to be more strict to get the benefits out of keto, and some people might be able to be more lenient, more like of an Atkins style eating pattern, or kind of more low carb. So
yeah,
it definitely depends.
Some of it comes down to what are the stakes, honestly. Right. Like, if I had brain cancer, you bet your ass I would be doing the strictest of strict keto. Like, if I had glioblastoma,
right,
I would be doing the strictest. Like, I would find myself a dietitian who specialized in keto. I'd be analyzing the macros and all the things. Like, I'd be doing the fat bombs if I needed the fat bombs. Like, I'd be all about it because the stakes are pretty damn high. Similarly, like, if I had a kid with epilepsy, or if I had epilepsy myself, that could be really, really difficult to deal with, and it could be really scary. If you collapse to the floor and you hit your head and you're convulsing, like, if there was an epilepsy situation, I would be recommending the strictest possible keto. Like, you do not slip up for a day.
Right. Right. Like, if you're having seizures 20 times a day, doing something like keto makes a lot of sense.
A lot of sense. Similarly, whereas, like, if you have a cancer that's going to kill you, right, like, do it.
Whereas if your goal is like weight loss or general gut health or something like that, there's a lot of ways to potentially do that. And maybe keto might help for your certain situation, but you could
unnecessary.
Right. Or maybe, again, you do a little bit low carb, but not necessarily to the extent where it would be considered traditional keto, or kind of more balanced low carb, so to speak. So, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, again, it's just when you're making difficult changes, or if you're restricting your diet, do the bare minimum you need to get the effect you want. Right. Like, and I sound like a lazy person because I am. But, you don't have to go above and beyond. Nobody's going to give you points. Maybe in like your keto online forums or something, maybe you get bonus points or brownie points. But really, in the grand scheme of life, nobody's going to give you bonus points for following keto like super strictly on a Tuesday. Like, it's fine. Just do what you need to do. But again, it's not to sound like we're belittling the experience of diabetes or insulin resistance or PCOS. Like, those things can be really awful to deal with and they can be detrimental to your health. But again, it's like, realistically, you do have some time. You could play with it. You could try different strategies. You could try herbs. You could try a bunch of different strategies for those things. And it's not as urgent as epilepsy and brain cancer.
Right.
Like, those are the ones that I would strongly consider doing strict keto and just sticking to it and not questioning it. For pretty much anybody else, I think that there's some wiggle room where you can make it your own.
Right. I would agree.
Yeah. I will throw out there one more thing, and then I think I might be officially out of things to say on this episode. I'm getting close to it.
Yeah, I don't think I have really anything else to cover. So shoot your shot with what you have left.
I will shoot my shot. If people are wanting to know how to do keto the right way, because again, we've talked about this, there's a right way and a wrong way. That sounds harsh, but whatever. There's like the common man's keto and like the ideal way to do keto. If you want to know how to do it the right way, finding a dietitian who's trained in keto and specializes in keto could be really, really helpful. Another starting point that you might want to explore is that Mike Mutzel has some pretty good stuff online, if I remember correctly. So the last name is Mutzel, maybe L-E? I think E-L is the spelling of his last name. He's been a pretty big keto guy for a while, but I have found that his stuff is generally pretty good. Like, he will post pictures of like really big, diverse, beautiful salads and like big pieces of avocado and like a little piece of meat. And, you know, I think that he has a pretty good take on it. He had a podcast, I don't know if it's still active, but he had a podcast called High Intensity Health Radio that was pretty solid, where he would interview like a lot of functional doctors and functional people. He himself is a nutritionist who's trained in functional medicine, if I remember correctly. And then he's got some stuff like on his website and whatnot. I know during the pandemic, just for full disclosure, I unfollowed his accounts during the pandemic because he was posting a lot of really harder core, like anti-vax and anti-COVID, like COVID's a conspiracy, it's made up kind of stuff. So his material on social media specifically from the last 2 years might be a little bit cringe. But if you go back a bit further, he should have some episodes and some social media posts about keto, because that was his main focus for quite a long time. And I do think that he has the right take on keto and he does it the right way, quote unquote. So if you want to get a little bit more information from the internet, he might be worth a follow. But like I said, you might have to scroll through about 2 years worth of some stuff that you may or may not agree with fully.
Yeah, I'm familiar with him. I know I actually got I think I got a free book from Macairo that gave me, I forget what his book's called, like a while back. I can
picture the cover, but I can't picture the title. I have it on my bookshelf.
Right, that's why I was looking behind me trying to figure out spelling and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think it's Mutz. Yeah, I don't even. Just Google. Google will autocorrect you on the spelling anyway, so who cares?
Yeah, so that's about it. I don't know if there's anything else.
I'm gonna Google the name right now because the spelling is E-L. It is E-L. Mike Mutzel, M-U-T-Z-E-L. What I would probably do is I would just start with like a YouTube search, Mike Mutzel Keto or Mike Mutzel Ketogenic, and listen to some of his episodes about that. And then you could poke around on his web. I think on Instagram, he goes by the handle Metabolic Mike, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
Like I said, I unfollowed him like 2 years ago, so I don't even know. But yeah, that could be a starting resource for people who are curious about how to do keto the right way. And then, like I said, really just finding a dietitian who specializes in that. Neither Amy or I consider ourselves keto experts, so please, for the love of God, do not come work with us in hopes of doing the keto diet, because we don't know that much about it. We wouldn't be super skilled at helping you hone in on that. But hopefully we've given you the information you need to make the right decision for you and ultimately mold this low-carb thing into what you need, as opposed to just following the masses and following the dogma on the internet. So As always, thank you all so much for tuning in for the IBS Freedom Podcast. We will see you very soon for another amazing and occasionally controversial episode. Take care.